Buenos días. Bienvenidos. Gracias por venir a este ciclo de conferencias que empezamos de primavera, de las organizadas por el departamento. Ahora vemos un pequeño la bienvenida al profesor HASHIM y simplemente lo voy a presentar. La presentación la hará Carmen y le voy soy nativo francés, estudio mucho francés y ahora soy adoptivo italiano. Por tanto, mi inglés es mi speak English is very deplorable. Good morning. I am Luis Agustín, Head of Department of Architecture of the University of Zaragoza. We'd like to thank you for joining us today here at School of Engineering and Architecture. We are opening today the 2023 lecture series organized by the department, and we're delighted to welcome very special and prestigious speaker, the Professor HASHIM. This invitation is possible thank you to Pablo de la Cal and thank you the company to usual way. So well like to thank both the team. My colleague Carmen Díez, Professor of Architectural History and Theory, will introduce our guest. In the name of the Department of Architecture and the School of Engineering and Architecture, welcome, Professor Sarkis, and thank you very much for coming.
So, good afternoon, all. Today, we initiate the spring semester series of conferences organized by the Department of Architecture, on this occasion by our colleagues of Urbanism. Thank you. I would like to especially thank Gaston Gaitan for making this event possible through the support of the Leisure Way. It is an honor to welcome Professor HASHIM, Dean of the School of Architecture and Planning at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, for this inaugural lecture here at our School of Engineering and Architecture. I will confess it is a challenge to present such a multifaceted person as HASHIM, and even more so in this short introduction. I will begin with some personal details because I think this could contribute to a better understanding of his trajectory and the scope of his accomplishments. Born in Beirut in 1964, HASHIM left Lebanon as a teenager to study architecture in the United States at RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design, when he earned the Piaget Award for Academic Excellence and bachelor's degree in 1987. Upon graduation, he pursued a Master's of Architecture at Harvard's Graduate School of Design, finishing again with distinction and the chairman's commendation, being the chairman at that moment, Rafael Moneo. I dare say that was a fortuitous encounter that had a notable impact on his biography. Some years later, Professor Sarkis received his PhD in architecture in 1995, again from Harvard's GSD, for the thesis Publics and Architects, Re-engaging Design in the Democracy. This title gives an idea of his interest and commitment to society, and also a perspective on the meaning of an architect's education. If I'm not mistaken, in 1996, Rafael Moneo contacted HASHIM to invite him to work with him on the souks, on the reconstruction of the souks in Beirut, an architectural project on an urban scale. His work on the souks is one of the many examples of Professor Sarkis' return to his hometown as an architect weaving together his academic and professional backgrounds. It's not unreasonable to assume that this proximity to Rafael Moneo, first as a student and then as a collaborating architect, has influenced his understanding of architecture and its relationship to the site and its history. And probably working on the Beirut Shooks, a project committed with the scale of the building, the scale of the city, and the quality and vitality of public spaces, was essential in his development as an architect. From then on, coinciding with the historical moment of the reconstruction of Beirut after the war, HASHIM Sarkis began to see professional opportunities at the end of the 90s. It was at that moment when the academic career he had imagined began to coexist with the professional one. Professor Sarkis opened his own office in 1998 and worked as a practitioner, principally in Beirut and Massachusetts. I'd like to mention only three of his projects: the Byblos Town Hall, the housing for fishermen in Tyre, and the Balloon Landing Park, all recognized with significant awards. In parallel, he continued with his academic commitments. At Harvard, he was appointed Aga Khan Professor of Landscape Architecture and Urbanism. At the same time, he was teaching at MIT, publishing his academic research, promoting the foundation of institutes, centers, or associations of architecture and urban design. And finally, in 2015, he was appointed as the Dean of MIT's School of Architecture and Planning, a position he still holds today. In 2019, he received one of the most relevant, I imagine also stimulating, commissions of his career, as he was appointed curator of the 17th Venice Biennale of Architecture. Just previous to the pandemic, he chose a theme for the exhibit, or more precisely, an open question to be addressed by the participants: how we will live together. Terribly present, given the impact of COVID, and certainly today, still a relentlessly compelling question for architects and urban planners. I won't go on, except to give one last brushstroke to this quick portrait of Professor Sarkis. In 1997, I had just begun to work for Rafael Moneo. The project for the Shooks in Beirut was being developed in the studio, and HASHIM would spend a few days each month in Madrid. We had crossed each other in the staircase once or twice, but I had never really talked to him. Working at Moneo's office at that time was highly demanding. I remember I was developing a master plan for a new maternity in Madrid. And one afternoon, after a, let's say, not very successful review of my work by Moneo, I was completely disheartened. None of my colleagues dared to come to my table due to the tension in the room and probably a fear of only making it worse. After a while, I felt somebody next to me talking in a warm, calm, quiet voice, trying to understand the problem and convinced that a solution could be found together. Probably HASHIM will not remember this episode. We never mentioned it. But for many years, I have been secretly grateful to him and his words, which gave me confidence and serenity. I just wanted to share with you this personal anecdote to conclude this introduction by highlighting HASHIM Sarkis' ties with Spain and also by pointing out some of his personal values. Not only a sensible and sensitive architect, a devoted educator, a skillful dean, but also, and this is not only my opinion, but the one of those who know him, a generous colleague and a wonderful person. So thank you very much, Professor Sarkis, for accompanying us today. You have the floor.
I promise you that after this, it will all be downhill. It'll be a disappointment. Thank you, Carmen, for such a generous introduction. It brings back beautiful memories. And thank you all for your hospitality. I was having dinner with Rafael 2 nights ago, and he said, you will see, Zaragoza is a very warm and welcoming city. And I already feel among friends. I feel with Carmen, Iñaki, Pablo, Gaston, I'm at home. I also feel at home because I like your tortilla very much. Gaston threatened that this is the best tortilla, and it is. It's really good. But I also feel at home because it seems like you have a very similar setup like MIT, a small school of architecture within a large engineering mentality, culture, etc. And like MIT, I feel like in talking to the faculty, there's this challenge, struggle that is actually quite productive. Sometimes in its history, MIT's School of Architecture decided, in order to prove its identity, to withdraw, to become its own isolated entity. We don't talk to them. And it proved to be too isolating. And other times, the School of Architecture said, let's become like the rest of the engineers, holier than thou, and they completely immersed themselves that they disappeared. And finding the right position between being completely isolated or completely subsumed has always been the workings of the school. And in more recent years, thanks to the growing interest in design, not just among engineers, but among many different fields, everybody is coming to us and saying, can you teach us how you design? And the importance of design to the other fields has helped us find that balance. On the one hand, they're interested in our methodology and our creative approaches, but on the other hand, we try to bring their rigor and approaches to optimization into design as well. So this has become the common language, and I hope you're able to find that common language with the engineers somehow here. But let me talk to you about blue. In his travels in South America, geographer, explorer, philosopher Alexander von Humboldt would go to document every aspect of the cultures that he visited. He would start with the geology, the soils, then the plants, the people, and then climb his way up what became very famous as his mountain sections. And he would represent them in these very elaborate sections that became really the basis of geographic documentation. Von Humboldt would classify everything, would describe it on the margins of his images, but additionally he would go on to measure the blue of the sky. He would carry with him a device called the cyanometer, which he helped refine. I don't think he invented it, which has 53 swatches of blue, and would insist on trying to identify the blue that is specific to the place. By now we know that this is useless. There is no such blue as a blue to the place. The blue tends to change with pollution, with humidity, with many things. But still the idea that you could bring the sky into the place, or better, that every place is just a degree of blue within a universe of blues, has captivated me quite a bit. Because I've always imagined maybe architecture, instead of being so grounded in its place, in its culture, in the responsibility of being about the place and heightening the value of the place, can also take you somewhere else, can make you aware that you are in the world. that when you enter a building, it transforms you. It takes you through the context, out of context. But it doesn't do that with bricks. It does it as a kind of shade of blue. That fascination, for me, the cyanometer represented for me that fascination that I have with the possibility of making architecture at once context expressive and context transgressive. That architecture can be in a context and take you out of context. And takes you out of context to construct alternative worlds, to construct ways of connecting you with the world. I've always been fascinated by the horizon line and the possibility that if we are able on this earth to achieve a point of view from where we see the horizon as curved, then we will be much better connected with the rest of the world. This global imaginary has been central to many things I've been interested in, and it's a question that I asked also to the Biennale participants last year, 2 years ago now, in the framework of how will we live together. And in many of the projects that they came back with, there were many inspiring responses to not just how will we live together, but how architecture can reflect on our cohabitation with others as an example of bringing us into this global imaginary. I'll share with you a few projects. A group from Amsterdam and Italy put together this housing for birds, which resembled the housing for people. And in this cohabitation, bringing the birds into our cities or our cities into the birds made us feel more similar with the other species. Or this group, Azra Jamia, professor at MIT in art, taking the Vitruvian Man and turning them into migrant workers that have just arrived from the Silk Road into Venice, and using their fabrics across the planet to tell stories about Venice, its connectedness to the world. Or this group, Ecologic Studio, turning the infrastructure of the house into algae that clean the air but also feed us, and therefore connecting us again to another invisible layer of the universe. This group bringing the cave back into the dwelling as the origin of dwelling, but also as something that we can reimagine in the post-Anthropocene as being the original house. So the historical origins of dwelling in the world. Or this group, Ram Labor, who won the Golden Lion for the best project, with their temporary school that treads lightly on the grounds to solve the problems of the grounds because they're polluted, and then once the problem is solved, they move on. This nomadic understanding of architecture. Or Alejandro Ravena's Mapuche Parlé structure, which is premised on the idea that land cannot be owned. So once land cannot be owned, how do we define architecture? The continuity of the surface of the earth is fluid underneath us. Or Tomás Saraceno's balloon architecture that uses those very pollutants in the sky to make space out of them. Or the work of Design Earth that tries to create narratives about connectivity across the world, in this case, an iceberg that is broken coming to cool down Saudi Arabia. Or the work of the Brazilian architect Angelo Bucci, where he imagines satellites going around the Earth, rotating and reflecting light so that we don't need to use reflecting light from the sun over the areas which are at night so that we don't need to use electricity anymore. Or the team led by Olafur Eliasson that brought together all of the participants in the Biennale to imagine the future assembly of the United Nations where the members include non-human beings. So it's the global imaginary that fascinates me, but the possibility of bringing that back into a locality, into a place, into architecture, and reflecting on how every project can take you elsewhere, that I would like to talk about today. The main protagonist of the presentation today is the project Carmen mentioned, which is a competition we won in 2011, the Byblos Town Hall. And it continues, even though the building is completed, there are phases of it that are still being planned, including the master plan of the city that has grown out of the Town Hall Commission. Byblos smaller than Zaragoza. It's about 100,000 in the metropolitan area. City is tiny, it's 5 kilometers square. It's considered to be the longest continuously inhabited city in the world, and that's why it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Give you some views. This is the can you see my cursor when I wrote it? So this is the historic core of the city that has been excavated by the French mandate to reveal the Hellenistic and the Phoenician city and the earlier settlements. This is a view of that excavated area where, as a result of that, many people left the downtown and lived in the suburbs. So the metropolitan area is an outcome of the excavation of the archaeology. But the archaeology is quite breathtaking because it shows you these earlier settlements and because of the proximity to the sea. Am I going backwards? No. And here you see the relationship with the suburbs, which is the growth outside of the boundaries of the historic city is rather chaotic. But the harbor is a major tourist attraction, almost desperately so. Trying to take the harbor here is a Crusader harbor, and trying to take the passage of different cultures as a form of attraction to tourism. It is actually the most visited site in Lebanon because it's an hour's drive from Beirut, and you can sort of dig into the past of the city, which is, as you may know, was Phoenician at some point and was the exporter of the alphabet to the rest of the world, the first alphabet. But this gives you a glimpse of how the historic city is trying very hard to capture the imaginary of the world. Hacienda de Pepe, Jardin de Biblos Fishing Club. So you have 3 languages in the sign as a way of attracting the tourists. Religious tourism has become a major attraction. These are churches that became mosques that went back to being churches from the Crusader era. And the kind of ostentatious interchangeability between Roman columns and the mosque and the dome. More recently, they started a new summer festival, which has been very successful in attracting international bands and musicians. For those of you who know the Gorillaz, the band? If you remember, the Gorillaz used to wear masks. The first time they took off their masks was in Byblos in 2007. So they wanted to be part of history. But the city is desperately trying to attract tourists, and because of the recession, the situation of war in Lebanon in different instances, the revolution, it is still very empty. And they try very hard, through a continuity of mayoral regimes, to improve on the city bit by bit. But in the meantime, this image for me, taken maybe 6 years ago, captures very much the spirit of the place. While waiting, we play on the beach. This is the council of the city that decided, this is the young guy, was the mayor at the time, he became now a member of parliament, decided to hold an open competition, anonymous open competition for the town hall. And this is how we entered to work with them. And even though we started with the town hall, the project grew to become a kind of advisory role for the city in helping them connect with the city, to improve on the city. And you will see why. The site we were given for the competition was the interchange on the highway when you come into the city. It's the most isolated site you can imagine because there's high speed on one side and low speed on the other, but still amputated from everything. And initially we thought that we would send back our panel saying, change the site. But a friend of mine who's an architect in Istanbul who deals a lot with these problems told me, no, design a building and then you change the site. And that's what we did. And we won the competition. And it consisted of 3 blocks that looked like rocks coming from the castle, the Phoenician castle, the Crusader castle in the downtown. That would be floating above the highway. And that as you drive by, you can somehow register a connection with the past, but cut obviously in a manner that makes it really feel modern. It also resembled many of the public institutions, you have them here in Spain as well, of the high modern era where a municipality is a repetitive bar, the post office is a repetitive bar, everything is a repetitive bar, but here repeating in a manner that is less orderly and more rhythmic with the highway and the interchange, but also with the views. And the section was a continuation of the park of the interchange underneath the building to the cafe and back to the ground. And that's the underbelly of the building, made of the same material as the facades. Here we had proposed wood, but it changed. In many ways, much of my presentation today will be how we take it out of a presentation that we were forced to make in black and white into realization and into full color, including the color blue. By the way, I don't know if they still practice this in Spain, but in Lebanon, the jury insisted that the presentation had to be in black and white because it made the poor companies and the rich companies equal. If you didn't have a full color printer, you were okay. And so that's how it came in to be in black and white. And then into full realization. This is Byblos, and you can see the site is right here at the end of the interchange as being the extension of the Roman Cardo of the Roman city. I will present the argument about a world imaginary in architecture through 4 different areas. One is the notion of the geographic. The second is the notion of the quasi-object. The third is the idea of the courtyard or the intense edge and open space. And finally, the facade or the surface of the building as an exchange surface among different sign systems. In all of these, I will try to bring in other projects that I've done that help illustrate or elucidate on some of these arguments. On to the geographic. So this is the site of Byblos, and you can see here the old historic city in light gray, the agricultural fields, which were quite important for a while, in the band between, and then extending into the mountainside above. And you can see the main connector to the city, which is flanking the Roman Cardo. And then the Crusader castle here, and another Crusader castle by the sea. This idea of a building that tries to connect to the city while being transplanted outside, both mentally but also graphically, is a project similar to a condition we faced when we did the housing for the fishermen of Tyre in 2006. This is another city that was blessed or cursed by the UNESCO World Heritage status, where as a result of acquiring that status, the fishermen who lived around the harbor could no longer build houses for their kids. So they created a cooperative with the help of many groups, and they moved out to find a piece of land that they got from the Greek Catholic Church in order to build housing for themselves and stay. The cooperative was called Staying because the choice for them was no longer living here or living outside. It was either living here or emigrating to Canada or to Australia where their cousins were. And the fishermen's community is probably one of the poorest communities still today in Lebanon. Their fishing is very folkloric. They had destroyed the sea flora, fauna because of dynamite fishing. And during the Israeli occupation of South Lebanon, they were not allowed to go in the water. And so they started learning other trades to complement fishing and still wanted to stay. And again, the global citizenship here for the poorest classes in the society is something that we need to think about. We always think of travel as being a luxury. But actually, these people are not able to stay because of their means, therefore they leave. And their imaginary is very global. My cousin in Toronto has a house and a stipend, I'm going to go to Toronto, rather than I'm going to go to Beirut, which used to be the form of migration in the 50s and 60s. So the land we were given was an agricultural land. It was a banana plantation or radishes, part radish, part seasonally radish, and then they planted bananas around, but it didn't last very long. The church gave it to them behind the hospital. And the area was sporadically getting developed with some apartment buildings here and there. And what I opted to do here is to hold on to the scale of the agricultural fields, because I knew that they would be falling apart and turned into little buildings, not just as a memory of the site, but also as a way in which we can register community and try to create an enclosure with a courtyard that brings you in but takes you up in the sky, and maintains a level of porosity that changes as you drive around it. And this is the corner outside where the community meets the city, but this is how it feels on the inside, half planted, half flat. We did that similar gesture in another project, which is the Balloon Landing Park in Beirut, a temporary building that is now removed, which brought a helium balloon into the city center as a way of taking people on rides while the center was being developed, so that you would be able to connect with the reconstruction of the city. Here, the slope of the site was diagonal, and we lifted one end and kept it open as a way to maintain public space for leisure, but also as a way of registering the different layers of the site. Another geographic project was the summer house that was never built on the Aegean coast in Turkey, where we wove between the existing olive trees a path, and as the site sloped, the path remained horizontal, and underneath it became the house. And it bent and curved to create public spaces for the family in between. Also followed a very similar geographic approach, which is where the building floats on the site, but registers in the section, as a result of a series of courtyards, the way in which, because of the site, every floor can get a courtyard that is on the ground. So every floor is a ground floor, even though if it's a 5-story building. And it is really in this connection between the geometry of the architecture, or its graphic presence and geography, where it doesn't get completely subsumed by the architecture, by the landscape, nor does it become completely disrespectful of it, that this notion of the geographic has developed. In this particular case, in an installation for Design Week in Amman, which was supposed to be a collaboration between artisans and architects and designers, I worked with the watermelon growing community. Watermelons in Amman are very famous. And we created a simulation of the 7 hills of Amman in the manner that they stack the watermelons when they sell them outside shops. And we used space mylar in order to cover them in the sun. Here it was a complete reenactment of a geometric pyramidal form that is found outside the shops in a kind of, I guess, a joke about the display, but also creating a landscape that is resembling the history of the place. Here again, the geographic registers as a kind of very strict geometry of a form that still adapts in different ways to register the site's conditions, which was this landscape around 4 houses that we designed called the court towers. I'll describe the court tower concept in a second. But here to reconcile an existing garden with another land, using plugins in parametrically optimizing the site conditions to create hills around the houses so that they are not visible from the back, but also to place them on the site so that they maximize the views and autonomy or independence between them. There were many other parameters that we worked with to maintain the view, but these are the houses as you see them from above. You hardly see anything except the 4 turrets, and these are the houses that you see from below. And if you look at the plan, it looks extremely randomized, but actually there are many visual and geographic parameters that help place these otherwise very strict geometries on the site. We here worked with the existing conditions of the site. It has a historical path that was planted there with eucalyptus trees to connect the sea, the main road with the sea. It was the radio station during the French Mandate. And we reenacted that road as being the main connector. But we also worked with Fernand Braudel's concept of the Mediterranean as the meeting of the pine tree and the olive tree to exactly do that. Bring the pines more to the water and the olives up here and then blend between them. And cover the underbrush with local plants that we worked with the local botanists to try to highlight. And you can see here the geography of the plants, which is at once trying to cover the ground, but still maintaining some of their geometry in that as a kind of demonstration of the palette itself and the merger of the two palettes. These are the eucalyptus trees along the path. And these are the olives. And these are the pine. Back to Byblos. When we placed the three buildings there, the idea was that they would be placed there in order to connect the different fragmented towns that emerged as a part of the kind of exodus from the city. In 1958, the French master plan, the planner was asked to, Michel Ecochard was asked to develop a master plan for Byblos. He had done one for Beirut as well. And in his plan was the origins of this main highway, which divided the city, created an interchange. But he also introduced a series of loops and passages across, which were very important in reconnecting the city with the hinterland that the highway was dividing. And we tried to work with that. We tried to work out of the kind of chaos of the fragmentation through the roads, a way of binding them back together, highlighting and clarifying the distinctions between primary, secondary, tertiary roads in order to pull it all together. Here we relied on some techniques from painting where you have a semblance of a chaos, but as you start squinting your eyes, you try to be able to extract from them lines that already exist, and all you have to do is pull them out. We proposed distribution of the entrances so that the pressure goes away from the interchange to entrances at the bottom and the top, putting clear signs there. An internal loop for tourists so that they would be able to take a bus that was donated to them by the government of a French town, a twinning process, I forget which one. And then creating a continuity along the highway to be able to turn what divides into what connects and gives a better image of the city than the signage that exists. But most importantly, the waterfront was itself the very divided front of 2 kilometers length that required some coherence, and even though it was public, many private concessions have taken over it. And here again, we tried to work our way through it by trying to extract from the conditions of the harbor and the front clear arc-shaped geometries that we would then put against the existing geometry without touching them. And it's this contrast between an abstracted geometry of the site and the site itself that again highlighted the conditions of the site rather than tried to blend the architecture in them, and maintained that contrast throughout many installations along the site. In this, I relied a lot on a concept that I've always liked in the work of a French human geographer called Paul Vidal de la Blache, where he talks about the fact that nature and the natural environment gives us as humans different avenues, different possibilities for human development, and the precise one is chosen by us. So this notion of possibilism says that the site is not going to tell you how you live. Geography, the setting is not going to tell you go that way, this kind of essentialization of our connection with nature. It's going to give you many possibilities and you will choose among them. And this geographic somehow resembles the notion of possibilism in Vidal de la Blache. And here I'm just going through them very quickly, but you can see the way that the geometry of the waterfront and the geometry of the band that we added on top, they remain separate, but somehow connected. The Byblos Town Hall works pretty much that way. The park continues underneath the building, and the building floats as simple geometric forms. And if anything, what it does as a result of that is register those differences both in section towards the highway and in section along the interchange or along the park. And here you can see the section of the building in relation to the larger setting, because it takes you visually, at least, when you're standing between the blocks where the windows are, to be able to connect to the mountain and to the sea. And that's how the the three volumes are organized. And you can see them here, floating above, but registering in their rotations many geographic relationships with the site. The other thing I want to mention here, it appears in this picture before I forget, is that since then we have also designed and built a bridge which carries you across the highway but connects you along this through a staircase to the Roman axis. So we carried the Roman axis all the way up to this point, and I'll show you another example later on. But let me talk specifically more about the objects themselves, or the object itself, and through this concept of the quasi-object. The building is made out of 3 blocks. These were 3 programmatic chunks that they have given us. The administrative headquarters, the mayor's headquarters, and an auditorium public function that was attached to them as well, with the idea that all the public services of paying your ticket, registering your marriage, everything happens on the ground floor. The volumes were rotated in such a way that you would get one view open to the sea and one view open to the mountain. That way, the volumes from the outside maintained the solidity against the southern sun, against the noise, and the view was simply entertained with this kind of cones of vision between the blocks. At one level, they created a field. They suggested a repetition that will continue, and I'll show you how we continued it. And at another, they started creating a figure between them because of the shape of the larger polygon and figure. And this idea that somehow a figure can emerge out of a perspectival order of an otherwise repetitive form is something that I've been also experimenting with in painting, and this is a series of paintings I've done called Les Parasols sans sol, which are the parasols without the ground, where, again, the perspectival shape or the shape of the coast as they are rotated along the beach create certain formations which otherwise you would not see if you were not looking at them perspectively. This idea that the shape acquires other value or other meaning as it relates to the site, bends a little bit, adjusts a little bit, is not dissimilar to a concept that Michel Serres has introduced and then Bruno Latour continued, which is the concept of the quasi-object. And for Serres, the perfect quasi-object is the soccer ball. I should say football here. Yeah? Okay. And he says the ball is not an ordinary object, for it is what it is only if a subject holds it. Over there, on the ground, it is nothing. It is stupid. The collective game doesn't need persons, people out for themselves. Let us consider the one who holds it. If he makes it move around, he's awkward, he's a bad player. The ball isn't therefore the body. The exact contrary is true. The body is the object of the ball. The subject moves around his son. Skill with the ball is recognized in the player who follows the ball and serves it instead of making it follow him and using it. It is the subject of the body. The laws are written for it, defined relative to it, and we bend to these laws. Skill with the ball supposes a Ptolemaic revolution, of which few theoreticians are capable, since they are accustomed to being subjects in a Copernican world where objects are slaves. So the ball bends, shapes, disconnects, and adapts, but it guides the game. And you can think of the way in which the ball activates the field. First, it activates the players. I was warned not to show my colors when I come to Zaragoza. I am a Real Madrid fan. Is that okay? Yeah, okay. And here is the best player ever being played by the ball. And that's his mastery. He sees the ball, it tells him what to do, and he makes it as if the ball is leading the game. But it's not only that. This actor network approach that Michel Serres has articulated applies to the whole audience. The ball makes us all come together. The ball activates us all. And here they are in Byblos, watching the women's final cup. I forget what year this is, and playing inside and playing outside with the ball. So I've thought about how that town hall could be the ball. that activates everything around it through a series. And if you look at the different formations of the projects we've worked with, they are all somehow slightly distorted in order to address the site, but they never lose their gestalt fully. They just adjust it to the conditions that they work with. The housing of the fishermen, as it wraps, becomes a pure figure, but on the outside it has an edge that's adjusts to the site. The houses might be perfect in geometry, but they bend to the site. And the balloon is a quasi-square. It's a square that wraps in around itself, almost like when you sketch, you keep drawing until you get the square right. It's a bit like that in order to adjust to the inexactitudes of topography. The project that I think does that the most is this project that I'm showing for the first time today. It's a biodiversity house, which is present in the Cedars Reserve of Lebanon. For those of you who've seen the Lebanese flag, we have a cedar tree in it. And the cedars of Lebanon are quite ancient. And even though these represent the first cases of deforestation when Solomon built the temple, when the Persians built their fleets and the Greeks built their fleets out of the Lebanese cedars, they are still kept recently, especially through the Shuf Cedars Reserve, and expanded. And beyond the forest which exists above here, altitudes between 1,500 and 2,000 meters. After that, you stop the tree line. The reserve have started expanding to include the productive landscape so that it is not like what happened in Byblos or Tyre, where you preserve the thing, but you leave life outside it. Here they try to bring the communities around into the project of preservation, bringing industries, especially agro-industries, to them, and trying to make a better connection between development and preservation. The site is precisely in that zone, and it is at the entrance of another forest where they're going to put the ibex, which is a goat that they're bringing back into the area after having left because of deforestation, for a very specific reason. You probably have the same problem in Spain. At the end of summer, you start getting fires. And the fires are not hitting the trees themselves, but are caused by the brush underneath. The shrubs that grow under the trees, these are the ones that catch fire. And the goats are best at eating them. So if the goats come in to eat them, they will help save the forest from fires. But the goats, while they work on very rough terrain, they have a hard time with the abandoned terraces that were built on the site. So they're trying to remove the stones from the terraces in order to create a relatively smooth surface. These are the stones and these are the shrubs. The idea here was that there's an existing building, and that existing building will become a museum of biodiversity to showcase the forest before you go there, and where the trail begins into the forest. So the building I proposed conceptually was basically this: a house following the profile of the Lebanese house. The lower part of it is assembled stone, and the upper part of it is the brush that would be taken, cut, charred so that it protects it from fire, and made into a hat over the existing building. This is the existing house. This entrance of ambulances, it used to be an emergency center. The entrance of the ambulances from here is now the entrance to the museum part. And the roof will become a cafe and viewing platform before you go into the site. We're working with ecologists to explain the mountain, not unlike von Humboldt's mountain. We're using the mountain here as the central feature to explain the different lives and strata for flora and fauna as you go from the coastline all the way up. That's the site as it exists. That's the structure on which we will be putting the charred wood, and the passage will be now from here, like the ambulances, you will be able to come down, take the ramp up, and go to the roof. And you can see it's a house that is bent and dipping into the ground, but maintains a level of geometry that you can recognize. That's the lower part. This is the facade. These are some of the views. The building will be painted blue so that you feel a bit disoriented about what is inside, what is outside. Still trying to get the right blue. And that's it from the valley. And that's it from inside. As you climb up the ramp, there will be, I've been asked to design the first exhibition. So the first exhibition is a mountain that will be built, it will be 7, 8 meters high. And as you go up, there will be information on the railing of the ramp explaining what you're seeing at that level. So the ramp and the mountain will be connected with each other. Back to Byblos. I hope this explains how these adjustments of otherwise pure volumes and their repetition both create a register of what is going on around them, activating the site, but also trying to hold on to their figurative gestalt presence. After we built this bridge, there was the problem of connection over this side road. And we decided to build another bridge with a staircase. By the point at the end of the exchange there, you have just enough to build the staircase. So it gave us the opportunity of adding a fourth volume, but also a volume that completes the replication without it being finished. But by virtue of the two faces coming to a point, it ends it. So the geometry again helps in activation, but also in finalizing itself. And this is the piece that you will see of the staircase at the very end of this repetition. And it becomes the prow for the whole city. In terms of programming, the building is a very simple layout. A ground that is completely open, and 3 volumes that we tried to make as empty as possible so that they can fill them up and change the program differently. I've noticed in visiting many public buildings how damaging the changes that they add to them from one administration after the other. And so as a way of not imposing anything, all we did is give them empty floor plates with the services around and let them do the subdivision themselves. That's the ground floor plan. That's the upper level plan with the mayor's office here and the auditorium on this side, which became a museum. And here again, you can see that we're focusing a lot on the intensity of the edges and the openness of the space. This is something that I worked on probably the most clearly in the balloon project, where here, in order to leave the clearing for the activities of the balloon and its operations, we pushed all of the entertainment activity on the sides. And it made it a very simple gesture of inscription along the edges, even though the building is very big. The footprint is big, but the edge is very small. You can see how you enter underneath it and come in. And this edge can flow in terms of activities. If the cafe is activated, it can float. If the game shop is activated, it can float into the space. A similar strategy we used in the 4 houses. And here again, the structure, the mechanical system, the retaining walls and everything are all concentrated in the edge. And the interior, even the interior of the tower, is completely open. The tower is 2 sides to protect it from the sun on the east and the south. But the rest of the floor plate is completely cantilevered. And in this project, probably more than others, that plays out at the level of every scale and detailing. So you can see it here becoming the retaining wall. You see it here under construction. This whole slab is it has no structure. All of these walls are non-structural. And you can see the plan. We used the retaining walls in order to protect from humidity, but also in order to draw air from them, which is colder than the air outside for the air conditioning. We created a passage of 60 centimeters here in the retaining wall. So all the circulation happens here, the mechanical basically happens here, and the structural happens here. And we even lifted the slab off the ground with a gap so that it can keep it cool, so you can walk barefoot on that as well. You can see the staircase coming down. Even the because everything in terms of service is compressed in that thickness, sometimes you run out of space. So for example, in the bathrooms, we needed more depth in order to make it more comfortable. So we pushed the sink out. And the sink becomes a window that looks sideways. And you can see it here and here and here. Importantly, the air conditioning system and heating system in the house is a gravity wall. I don't know if you've ever heard of that technique. It's an amazing technique we worked on with Transsolar in Stuttgart. It's a radiator that you put behind the closet or you put behind the bookshelf. And it's a radiator of cold water. We took the water from the sea, in the depth of the sea where it's cooler. In the coil, it cooled fresh water. And that fresh water is put in the radiators behind these closets. The warm air comes in from the top, and by gravity's push, gets cooler and comes out from the bottom. It's very ambient. There's no air pushed, and it's very effective. But here again, it was compacted in the thickness of the wall. But this idea comes from much more than just the practicalities of creating an empty space in the middle. Again, it comes back to the idea that life will be better if architecture leaves it alone, and if we put all of the possibilities of what architecture can offer on the edges and let them seep into life, or life influences them as it happens. Plus, I'm also very interested in courtyards, which is what that is. In this case, the courtyard is very important because it helps in the ventilation of the houses. And the towers themselves, when you open the windows, they suck the air out, and they have outlets in the section of the staircase in order to bring the hot air out. But most importantly, the courtyards are a window to the sky. And therefore, wherever you are, you get a swath of blue, and it somehow takes you from wherever you are into somewhere else. That's the courtyard in relation to the house. And here you can see that the thicknesses of the walls become benches, counters, doorways, and each is treated differently motif-wise. Here it's a bench outside. And to take this further, every bedroom becomes not, when you open the shutters and when you slide out the windows, it becomes a balcony. So the bedroom is not just the bed, it's the view onto the sea. We use that similar technique in the thickness of the retaining wall that holds the pool, which is all the services. And the way it opens again registers that thickness. And also in the common house that has the similar idea, but in section, where the roof becomes everything and nothing happens, no partitions happen underneath it. Similarly, we did something like that in a project that was never built, which was a daily prayer mosque, where the passage and the services are on the edge, and the space of the mosque becomes completely open. This was at the time when there was a controversy about the minarets in Switzerland. If you remember, they didn't want people to have minarets in Switzerland mosques. They decided to cut them. And so here, instead of removing the minaret, we made it the same height as the building, but a result of a cutting at the corner. And you can see it here. So that's the outside, a series of blocks that create the aggregation, and the inside is completely open, curved space with openings from different sides. Tried to take the strategy to an urban scale, where we were designing an academy for the Aga Khan Foundation before the war in Syria outside of Damascus. And here again, this intense perimeter is applied at different scales, at the scale of the site itself, but then at the scale of every block within it, where you can see each piece opening up to become an edge with courtyards inside, and then adjusting it in a quasi-object way to the conditions of the site. Byblos, if anything, has it both in plan and in section. And till today, this kind of openness of the space has allowed them for using it for a variety of options, while the building itself creates this containment and protection against the highway. Always come back to this quote from Paulo Mendes da Rocha in thinking about the impact of this approach, where he says that architecture is the art of delineating the space for life's unpredictability. Finally, I would like to speak a little bit about the idea of the exchange surface. But let me illustrate it through two different problematics of the facade. Probably for someone who's very interested in the possibility that architecture takes you somewhere else, the facade and the representative dimension of the architecture always comes in the way. It is the moment where the building has to speak, has to communicate, and it speaks a local language, or otherwise it doesn't communicate. So, in the case of Byblos, we had to deal with very specific conditions of turning the surface into something that speaks. When we proposed it for the competition, we made it look like big blocks and made out of big or smaller blocks. But actually, in reality, these small blocks are about 3 meters by 6 meters each. There's no way you can find a block like that. So when we won the competition, we said, okay, now how are we going to make this happen? It was made out of sandstone to reflect the underlayer of the Crusader castle and many of the churches, and they had peeled off or stolen the limestone that covered them. So sandstone became the exposed stone and the most expressive element of the city. So it became the official stone of the city, even though it's a stone that was meant to be protected, on the outside covered with lime, on the inside covered with like a stucco, a calcium-based stucco, to protect it from falling apart. But here they are using it very proudly as being their stone. And actually, frankly, I hate it, and I don't like using it, but we were almost forced to do that. So I started saying, well, maybe we can cheat. Maybe we can make something look like it's sandstone without sandstone. And in a way, architecture's materiality sometimes is without material or without color. If you remember when you were kids, you would be given a coloring page to fill in, and you can color with anything. And especially when it came to birds, whatever you colored, it looks arbitrary, but it looked believable. It can be a bluebird, it can be that, it can be that. And this technique we've used in the housing of the fishermen in Byblos, and we used it in a panicky way. I'm, like probably many of you, trained in a very modernist tradition where form is either the authentic material or it's white. And we never used color. We had what medically can be called a chromophobia. And in Byblos, I had made it white, and the contractor was going to make it a thick patina of white with a texture and all. But we reached a point where we ran out of money. And I got a desperate call from the contractor saying, we're going to leave the site very soon, and we need to paint this building. And it cannot be the material we don't have money. So you have to rely on paint. I said, okay, what color? They said, all colors cost the same. We tried to paint it white, but actually, because the plastering underneath it, the cement plastering underneath it, was made with the idea that the aggregate will be thick, you couldn't paint it with a thin white because it would show all of the defects. At which point I said, okay, let's go with color. And we went for all the lessons in architecture history that we had forgotten about, the polychromie architecturale of Le Corbusier, especially his fascination with the color blue, especially the ultramarine blue. And I thought that maybe on the outside we can give it a blueness so that it distantiates the way Le Corbusier has used always blue. And then let the warm colors be on the inside, leaking to the outside in different intervals. I did a series of tests also using not just his palette, but the Joseph Albers palette, using some of the vernaculars. And the result was just out of the Robinson color, what do you call them, like the Pantone colors. We used those in order to match. But importantly, the composition was not so much the block itself or the window or the apartment, but a scale in between so that it doesn't look like a repetitive system, nor does it look like a monolith. So somebody called it more like a symphonic organization of form. And here you see the blues on the outside, and we played against the sun when the sun was hitting so that the darker color is in the front and the lighter one is in the back, and we played with the sun when you were facing north. And then we let the colors from the inside leak at the different corners. But there's a level of arbitrariness in this that, is very clear, and it's honest about it, because, the cement can be colored with any material, with any color. We use this same blue, the outremer, ultramarine. How do you call it in Spanish? Outremer, ultramarino, which, as you know, comes not from the sea, but comes from the fact that lapis lazuli, which is the origin of the blue pigment, came from overseas. And so lapis lazuli gave its name to the outremer, and it gave its name to azul as well, which is the blue color. So outremer is a very specific tone now, but it comes from the lapis lazuli. And here we used it as a way of defining a facade that aligns with everything, but floats and sets back in the La Strada Novissima that was made for the Shenzhen Hong Kong Biennale of 2012 or 13, I forget. But here it is, a little pavilion representing our work made out of that. But then there is another way of suggesting coloration. And this is very well represented in the way that recently we've discovered the technique of coloring black and white pictures, of coloring black and white photographs, where you understand that, for example, Abraham Lincoln's skin was of a certain tint, and his hair was a certain color, and therefore you start from that extrapolating the other colors. It may not be exactly true, but you get at it somehow. We did that in this branch library in Beirut, a competition that we never got, where the pigmentation of the concrete begins to change to suggest something of the sea. We did this in the concrete of the balloon project, where we took the very earth that was there, which was very deep red, and put it in the concrete, and then used the pigment to resemble it. But importantly, we used the same pigment, which was the earth, and colored the wood out of it, which is the formwork of the concrete as well. But I still had to deal with the sandstone. And here you have the facades of the buildings along the Roman axis, all forced to cover them with sandstone. They gave it a rustication, and here obsessively they started removing the calcium cover of the stucco off the old buildings to show the sandstone. And you can see it's like badly put together. It gets humidity, it falls apart. And I kept pushing away. No, I don't want it to look like this. I don't want it to look like that. Until one day, I get a phone call from the team on the ground and saying, Hashim, 4 shipments of sandstone blocks have arrived on the site. You have to use them. And I mean, these pictures are just to show you how bad it is, and this is where it is from the castle. And these were the 4 shipments. They were of a certain size and clearly not of the same color. At that time, I was buying stone in Verona for another project. And I saw this amazing travertino, but red travertino. And I said, I wish the sandstone could look like this. And I looked at it and I said, well, maybe the sandstone could look like this. So went back, and there's a very smart Syrian worker from Aleppo who had just come because of the war. And I asked him, given the thinness, how small can it be without us needing to put a frame around it? And he gave me dimensions which resembled those of the Roman brick. We cut a few of that dimension and realized that the smaller you cut it, the more you can say the color is of a certain shade. It can be white, it can be pink, it can be yellow. And so I took the travertino, pixelated it, identified 4 shades, matched those 4 shades with the stones that we had, and then created a pixelation map where we not only pixelated that block, but we carried it around the whole facade so that it would look like it was carved off one big block. And we started cutting the pieces on site. And we classified them into 4 shades. And then with one drawing and one guy standing on the scaffold, he would give him the color based on what it is, and they would hang them. And you can see, because it's so small, we only needed mortar on the back. We didn't need it more. And that's the drawing that they were working with. And I promise you, they did 2 mistakes of not matching, which they saw them from a distance, fixed them, and once they got that, they did it all on their own with no time. But here again, we tried to also reveal the thinness of it, and this is Ma'allam Nazmi, the Syrian worker who helped us solve the problem. So we went from this to the rendering to this, and that's how the building looks today. And you can see how it turns the corner here, how it looks from a distance, and when you get farther away, it looks much more monolithic. And on a rainy day, it actually looks very good because it highlights the different colors at a distance. But there's another thing about the surface in architecture. For some reason, architecture has forgotten a role that it had as the host for the other arts, meaning the possibility that it's not the architect who becomes the sculptor and the designer of the door and the doorknob and the graffiti and the graphics and all of that, but they accommodate other artists. You create a decoration program for the other artists to participate in it. And here we thought that maybe we can come back to that. We had many elements that needed intervention graphically in order to communicate the base of the building, the pergola, the facades themselves, but also the signage. It's a public building, it needed signage on it. In Byblos, in Tyre, in the housing of Tyre, this is the original white stucco, which thickness. I had used a stencil in order to indicate the different names of the buildings using Arabic calligraphy. Ultimately, we couldn't use it on the facade, but we managed to use it in the screens, to use the letters. And in a way, we faked a kind of hieroglyphic on the side facades in order to register that. In the balloon project, and because it was like an airport, and because it was cheap, the inside was made out of asphalt, and the signage was made out of words that looked like what you would see at an airport. But importantly, as we started dealing with the wood formwork, which was a chevron, but a chevron sideways so that it would be pointing, we created patterns that were really following the arrow system, like, again, an airport or a heliport. And here you see the signage of kids. Kids are sitting there. Exit, we made it too dense in the concrete so that you exit from there. And that we played with as well in the public library. In Byblos, we thought they wanted us to speak about Byblos as the inventor and communicator of the first alphabet. So we thought for the pergola and the facade, maybe we can work with a barcode that said Byblos, and that we would play with it as if you're driving on the highway and you have your camera, you click and it tells you Byblos. Using the most advanced kind of language for machine to machine, and then using it on the facade. Now, came back the color. Obviously, I would have liked a blue, so I started with a blue. But which blue? And let's face it, we as architects think that the plan and the logic of the building is going to tell us everything about all the decisions. But there are points where it becomes very arbitrary. I mean, no matter what we say, it has to be arbitrary. And for me, when I'm desperate about a color, I go to Dries van Noten's collection of that year and choose from Dries van Noten. I highly recommend his color palette, because not only it will be current, but it lasts for a very long time. And that season, it was a very deep Prussian blue, which happily was working with a sandstone color, so I copied the Dries colors. What's great about it is that when we applied it to the aluminum, the deeper the color, the more reflective it is, and the closer it is to the sky. And it creates this bouncing of the buildings against each other, but it also opens it up to the sky in a very beautiful way. Especially in the reverberations when the bridges happen in the building. But that barcode became the source for many other inspirations. We were asked, what about the Phoenician alphabet, and how do we use it? So we looked at it, abstracted it, And we tried to make geometric forms out of it, but then we also wanted to apply it on the solid wall that protects from the highway. And because of the idea of speed behind, we thought that maybe repetition can happen. And repetition led us to another alphabet, which is the Morse code. And so we made a Morse code that said Biblos out of the signage and created this kind of banding on the facade. And you can see it here in the renders and then here in the facade itself. And I suggested that this wall becomes a mural wall for different artists to come, but because of the pandemic, because of the recession, it is still our mural that is standing there. And then we used the Arabic alphabet for the signage on front. The important thing about that is that it allowed more a kind of creation of a surface that is not singular in what it was trying to communicate, but using the graphic and using languages of different sorts to create a surface of exchange of the signs between each other, flattening them all into the architecture and providing a relationship between the Arabic calligraphy, the Phoenician, the calligraphy of the stone, and the barcode as well. This has been the strategy, by the way, of Robert Rauschenberg, who in his pop art allowed different languages to mix on the surface, but he kept them two separate from each other. But Jacques Rancière reminds us that actually in the highest moments of abstraction in modern architecture, in modern art, there was never a sense that this art was without reference. It was to the contrary, putting the shape of the guitar next to the texture of the wallpaper, next to something else, that you created a surface of exchange between the different sides. And in this strategy, I'm hoping that the surface of architecture becomes a kind of universal, global surface of exchange among science systems that we have been using. It is a story that has yet to continue or finish, because from the city plan, as you know, we have the plan for the bridges. Sorry, from the town hall plan, we have the plans for the bridges, we have the plans for the roads, we have the plan for the coastline, but these are waiting to happen. And as you know from projects you've dealt with, that architecture is very vulnerable. And sometimes I worry about this building because it has been subsumed by the kitsch that takes over cities when they try to decorate. This is for Christmas 2016, the year it opened. They decided that that blank surface that we had could be used for animation, especially as you're driving over the highway. So they turned it, not just the front, but the sides as well, into Christmas decoration. And every now and then I get the question, why did you not open a window on the southern facade? And so far, we've kept that away. The building won a major award from the Union of Arab Architects, so that has protected it. The public space has been used for activities, and that backdrop has always been lit up, so hopefully it helps. And at the opening, I couldn't go there, and they told me, you have to say something about the building. And I remembered that in Andalusia, public buildings, when they opened, they would invite a poet to write a poem, which would be etched in the building. And invariably, they used the voice of the building speaking to the public. And so I wrote a poem which is called I'm the House. And in it, I describe the building, different functions and different roles, and beg, as if I'm the building, for them to protect me. You know, I'm giving you an open space, don't divide it. I'm giving you walls of stone, don't break them. I'm giving you, park, let it grow. So a kind of a sign of despair of that. And everywhere I go, like in Zaragoza, I try to talk about Biblos and let them know how well it was received as a building. You like it, right? It will help save it if you like it, okay? So, and so here in the exhibition we did in Chile, Biennale, it was all about Biblos, and we called it Biblos Blue. So I'm hoping that, again, with the radiation of the town hall, when it happens into a town plan, it will also help it and ground it in the city. But there are many blues, as you know, in our palette, including this blue, which is the blue that you hang against the evil eye. So maybe the blue of the building will save it from being transformed or destroyed or turned into yet another public building which is unrecognizable. That's the story I wanted to tell you about the color blue, and these are all the people who helped make it happen. Thank you very much. Open to taking questions, but I don't know what the protocol is for questions.
Thank you, Hashim. Thank you very much for this inspiring lecture about your projects, always attentive to the site through the geometry, the color, the materiality, the perception. Very suggestive, great lecture, thank you. I want to know if you still have 2 minutes, for just in case somebody
No, more than 2 minutes. I'm open to questions.
I'm sure that...
My train is not until 4 o'clock.
Okay. So...
If it's Iñaki, it's going to be a tough question.
Very briefly, because we all know that it's the tortilla time, so we have to probably go to highlights. But anyway, I just wanted to thank you for being today with us, and thank you also for this amazing lecture, because this is having actually a lesson of architecture. In that sense, I don't know, I guess that you may remember that the course that I took with you at Harvard was constructing vision. In a way, everything that you have been speaking about today is about how we perceive and how we see architecture. At that time, 20 years ago, this idea of approaching architecture as a subject that does this reading, phenomenological reading, and everything that has to do with the way we perceive architecture beyond its physicality and the object, understanding architecture as just an object. It's something that we have been able to experience on the way that you have explained your own work, which by the way was impressive. I congratulate you for that. So I don't know, given that we're in the school, if you think that focusing on the way we teach design and architectural design and urban design, this idea of phenomenology and the idea of the way we perceive architecture is something that has to be on the first line of architectural teaching. That's a question.
Again, it's bringing back beautiful memories. That class I still teach every now and then, and it's my favorite class. But in that class, thank you for bringing it up because it can help me elucidate a few points here. We talked about how architecture becomes a framework for developing certain habits of seeing and habits of behaving through seeing. And therefore, conditions of horizontality, for example, become prevalent in a project as a way of guiding us to how to use it. And I hope it was clear that I was foregrounding the formation of habits of seeing and operating in the space over program. That program is pushed into the thickness of the wall, and now let's live together. Let's inhabit the space ways we want. And the architecture's ability is more to do this rather than to say this is important. And that influence is probably the most strongly expressed or communicated through visual practices. Therefore, many of the buildings operate as apparatuses of seeing, rather than just, you live here, you sleep here, you do that. Byblos is very much about this kind of continuous cut that allows you to think that the horizon is in front of you, but it's actually blocked at every instance. It's also a series of cones of vision. You look this way, you look that way. The balloon is all about that, right? I mean, the balloon is about taking you underneath in order to go up. And that orchestration of how you see becomes how you move, becomes how you inhabit the space. So, thanks. Any other questions? Other thoughts? I actually have a question for you. You don't have to answer them, but on your way out, you tell me what you think of that turquoise in the museum. I'm not very convinced. The problem is that turquoise, remember in the museum there's a turquoise of the existing building, we painted it turquoise, and it's the turquoise of their logo. So I felt like I owe it to them since they were using blue, an homage to the sky and the turquoise. But it's a little bit too green, and I don't know what to do. So if you can help me suggest, I see a very nice turquoise over there. Maybe we can borrow your sweater on your way out. Okay. I'll take a picture. Other thoughts? You're getting hungry, no?
I think we can close the event. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thanks.